And so that's really the issue that we're having. So, you know, I went over the role of the state and our threefold role, and beyond that, we want to help communities develop to be whatever they want to be. You know, if they want to be a transit community, that's okay. If they want to be a bike ped community, that's okay. If they want to be a car community, that's okay too. But we want people to manage their own business and not just proceed on with no management and then expect the state to come in and fix everything. So what we need to do is encourage or require local governments to properly manage growth, and then the question comes, how do you do that? So let me just jump into this briefly and get to the relevant components and how I think we can start addressing this problem. What we're doing right now is updating our state transportation plan. The plan that we have in place right now was adopted in 2003. It's a 30-year plan. We update it every 10 years, so that's what we're in the process of doing right now, is updating this, and it'll go out to 2044, I believe, is the horizon year. We did a review and status report in 2008. It was not a plan update, it was just a review of where we were in implementation. Let me just say too that the transportation plan covers all modes of transportation, and it's passenger and freight both, and economic growth for Louisiana is a major driver in that. Well, what's in a statewide transportation plan? There's policy actions in there, things that don't cost any money, but they do require some effort. And just an example that has come up several times and came up again this time is the hours of operation of ports, and particularly the Port of New Orleans. And that deals with a labor issue with the longshoremen. The truck drivers would just as soon work all night if they could, because they can get in and out of the port and make more hauls in a workday than they can if they're working during the congested parts of the day. The problem is the longshoremen don't want to work shift work. They'll work extra, but they want to be paid overtime pay at time and a half rather than a shift differential. You know, but police officers, nurses, plant workers, a lot of people work shifts and they get a shift differential. It's not time and a half, but they do get a shift differential, and if you're the newcomer on the block, you get the worst shift, and that's the way it works. And as your seniority grows, you get better and better shifts until you get the shift you want. But, so that's a labor issue, so that's an example of a policy action. And most of the plan is programs. How much money do we need to be spending on maintaining what we have? Highway asset management, for example, or operations, or safety, or transit, or bike ped, or rail crossings, etc. How much money every year should we be spending on those programs? The projects actually get picked through an annual project selection process. You could not lay out, it would be a waste of time to try to lay out 30 years worth of bridge replacement projects, for example, because conditions change. And so you don't want to try to do that. You don't want a laundry list, 30-year laundry list of projects. You want to set it up programmatically. But we do have some specific projects in there, and these are what we call mega projects. They're very large, high-cost projects, interstate widenings, major bridge replacements. A good example in the New Orleans area is the Belle Chase Tunnel, if you're familiar with that. If you go down to Plaquemines Parish, you'll go through the Belle Chase Tunnel. There's a Belle Chase Tunnel and there's a bridge right next to it. Well, the tunnel's not in good condition and it needs to be replaced, and so what we would like to do is replace the tunnel and the bridge next to it with one mid-level fixed bridge. Very expensive project. So it's a mega project, happens to be in the highest priority that we have. Another good example is the I-10 bridge in Lake Charles. Calcasieu River Bridge, as it's oftentimes called, which was not built as part of the interstate system. It was there already and was incorporated into the interstate system. It's about 70 years old now, and it needs to be replaced. So it's very expensive, $400 or $500 million just for that one project. And then we have some standalone plans that are incorporated into the overall statewide transportation plan. I did want to point this out to you, since we are talking about local planning. One of the things we did a telephone survey, and we ask about a number of things, including taxation and what would you want to pay for and things like that, and what do you think the highest priorities are and such. But the reason I wanted to show you this slide here is it deals with what kind of Louisiana do we want. And so we asked people, do you want to live in a state with large cities like Atlanta or Dallas with high density development? Not too many people wanted to do that. We asked them, do you want to live in a state with large cities like Atlanta or Dallas with suburban type development, which is really what Atlanta and Dallas are. Not too many people really wanted that. Or do you want to live in a state with small and medium-sized cities with open space between them? And that's what the majority of people who cared wanted to do. That's actually the majority of people anyway, but there's about 30% of the people said they didn't care one way or another where they lived. So really, what we took away from this is that Louisiana people are not big city people. Most of us could move to Houston or Atlanta or Dallas and make more money than we make here, but we don't want to do that. Personally, I have no desire to live in Houston, and I would rather have less money and live here than live in Houston. So, and I think that's what people are saying in this. We came up with a vision, and part of it dealt with that particular issue about small and medium-sized cities with open space between them. There is some sentiment for higher growth, dense, compact urban areas in New Orleans and some in Baton Rouge, and we're certainly not against that. But we did a visioning workshop, and we had some representative from the Department of Economic Development there, and we talked about, well, what about the economy? Because where your economy goes generally depends on, a lot of things depend upon that, what kind of transportation system you need, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's what the extractive and resource industries deals with. That's agribusiness and petrochemical and things of that nature, and we don't see that changing as being the primary focus of Louisiana's economy. The alternatives that we looked at were trying to turn the state's economy to be more one that focuses more on arts and entertainment, and retirement and tourism, try to be a major retirement destination, or to get more into the R&D, high-tech arena. And the consensus opinion is that why we should try to pursue those and develop those segments of the economy, that our bread and butter is still going to come from those more traditional industries in Louisiana. And then we looked at the growth scenarios in regards to development, and we had basically 3 scenarios. And forgive me if I don't get the names quite right, because I couldn't quite remember them. We had our status quo scenario, which is just continued suburban sprawl, which is what we have right now. We had more of an urban centers where we really just focus on the large urban areas, those metropolitan areas, and we sort of forget about everything else. And then we had what was called the town centers concept, where we focused on all of the urban areas, large and small, the small being 5,000 or more in population, all the way up to, New Orleans, which is the largest metro area that we have. That was the preferred scenario, the town centers scenario, but most people came to the conclusion that we were going to probably continue on the status quo with just a continued sprawling development out into the green fields. And may not be what we want, but that was the consensus as to where we were headed. But there may be some hope in there. So, let me just cover one other thing. We had 5 goals, and you see those on the side of the screen there: preserving what we already have, infrastructure preservation, safety, economic competitiveness, community development, enhancement, and environmental stewardship. So I want to focus on some of the recommendations that came out of our advisory council on community development and enhancement. And one of those dealt with one of the recommendations that came out of the research, which was continue to fund transportation plans, but expand the scope to include land use and public buildings and facilities and public infrastructure, including stormwater management, drainage, utilities, transportation, et cetera. So that's one of the recommendations. And then another is to provide funding for a portion of rural transit operating expenses to meet the current and future expansion needs. We have a number of parishes in this state that have no transit service whatsoever, not even for elderly and handicapped people, yet we have an aging population. And so what we would like to do is get some transit system started in every parish, some basic service. In rural parishes, it looks different than it does in urban parishes. You're using vans and it's demand responsive. It doesn't run on fixed routes. You have to call and make arrangements to be picked up and things like that. But nevertheless, it can, once you have your basic transit system in place, you then can expand it if your population expands and your needs expand, et cetera. And so that's what we would like to do. Right now, federal funds will provide 50% of your operating expenses, but a lot of local governments cannot come up with the other 50%. And so what we're proposing to do is pay for 25%. So the feds would pay 50, the state would pay 25, and local government would have to pay 25. This next one is pretty important. Develop a state-administered local assistance program to rehabilitate and reconstruct locally owned roads. And the local match that we would require may vary according to transportation planning criteria, and I'm going to cover that in just a minute. The last one you see on that page, preserve buffers, preferably as wetlands mitigation, to provide separation or the appearance of separation between adjacent communities. And that's what people want. They don't want to be absorbed into the sea of development. They want to maintain their identity, from the question that we asked them in the random poll we conducted. And if you've ever been to southern France, I was fortunate enough to be able to do that, it's really interesting because you come across these towns and they're fairly densely developed, but they're very well defined. In the United States, you have houses spread along every road and they're just lining the roads. There, it's not like that. There's these open fields, farm fields, and then you come to this town or village, and it's fairly compact community there, and it's really kind of neat. And I think that's what people were expressing themselves in the development preferences they would have, in that they like that village type concept, and so you can actually have a larger urban area that's comprised of an accumulation or aggregation of a bunch of these villages if you can just give the appearance at least of separation. And most people view separation by what they see from the road, whether they're driving or riding in a bus or riding a bicycle or walking. What do they see from ground level? That's how they make their determination about whether they're in a sea of development or whether there's some distinction between the various communities. And so we believe that if we can provide buffers, greenways, if you want to call them that, preferably as wetlands banks, wetlands mitigation, to provide that separation that it can serve us well. And so right above that, not highlighted, you will see the recommendation work with congressional delegation to create wetland mitigation credits for preserving existing wetlands. Right now, the way the Corps of Engineers works, and I'm not an expert at this by any means, but I think I have a basic understanding of it. If you do a project, whether it's a highway project or a developer is doing a development somewhere, and he's going to disturb 20 acres of wetlands, the Corps of Engineers, when they give you a permit to do that, they're going to say that these wetlands are worth X number of credits, and you need to go buy replacement wetlands from a wetlands bank that equal this number of credits. Well, if I go to a wetlands bank, the wetlands may be of a lower quality. So I might wind up, my 20 acres, having to buy 100 acres from a wetlands bank, or 60 acres from a wetlands bank. Well, if I preserve existing wetlands, I get almost no credit for that. And wouldn't it be better if we didn't disturb wetlands at all to begin with, that we keep what we have? And so our feeling is, why can't, the national policy is no net loss of wetlands. So meaning if I disturb an acre, I should replace it with an acre in a wetlands bank, which are artificially created wetlands. Why can't I have a policy that says, okay, Eric, you've disturbed 20 acres, you need to go get this number of credits out of this wetland bank, which may be 60 acres out of the wetlands bank. Why can't I go buy 20 acres out of the wetlands bank and preserve 100 or 150 acres of existing wetlands? Why can't I do that? And you know, that's what we're asking for, is to give us more credit for preserving existing wetlands. We're still maintaining the policy of no net loss in wetlands, but the Corps does not recognize that right now. They give you almost nothing for preserving existing wetlands. So if we had that in place, you could very easily provide a lot of these buffer space, because developers could then just buy up land, give it to the local government, put it into perpetual public ownership so it could never be developed, and you would have your greenways. So what are the plan elements that are important to local governments? I did want to point out for people that are into local bridges, we are proposing to quadruple the size of the off-system bridge program. That's for parish and city-owned bridges. It's not really relevant to our discussion here today, but I just wanted to point that out, that there's a lot of news articles about the bridge problem in Louisiana. We hopefully will address that head on. This is all dependent on us getting additional resources, which we hope to get in the year 2020. The program that I mentioned on the previous slide, the new local road rehabilitation program, we don't provide any funding for that now. We're proposing a program at $30 million per year. So it's a pretty healthy program to go in and rebuild and rehabilitate locally owned infrastructure. And then, as I mentioned, the rural transit program, $10 million a year for that is what we're proposing. And relevant to the discussion today is the state highway capacity program. These are for small capacity projects, not the big major corridor level projects, just regular projects you might come across in a city that need to be widened from 2 lanes to 4 lanes or what have you. Well, how would we use these programs to encourage local governments to do a better job at managing growth? Well, I've got the 2 listed up here that I think are most relevant, the new local road rehabilitation program and the state highway capacity program. The new local road rehabilitation program, we would have some requirements on that to even be eligible to participate. And one of those is you have to have a basic maintenance program for your infrastructure. To do otherwise would be it would be similar to buying somebody a car. They never will change the oil. They burn up the engine, then they want you to get them another car. So the answer to that is no. You have to have some basic maintenance program so that if we come in and spend state money to rebuild this particular road, you're actually going to take care of it and manage it and maintain it properly. Secondly, you need an inventory of what your infrastructure is. What are you actually responsible for maintaining? And you think, well, that's common sense, Eric. You'd be surprised how many people don't know that. How many local governments don't even know what they're responsible for maintaining. We send them maps and we say, look, here's what we think you're maintaining. Just tell us if this is right or not. And we can't even get a response. So I don't know how you can manage anything if you don't even know what you own, but you'd be surprised how many people don't even know what they own. So we need to incentivize them to at least get a handle on that. If you're going to address problems, you got to at least know how big the problem is. And then we would require a match. You would have to put up some of your own money. The state's not going to come in and just do all this at 100% for you. You're going to have to match that. And maybe that match, we haven't written any rules for this, maybe that match is a 50-50 to start off with. But if you have a basic land use and infrastructure plan, as we've talked about previously and as Dr. Rennie talked about, you know, maybe that match gets cut. Maybe it's only 30% instead of 50%, because you've taken a major step in showing that you're managing your business. And do you have any kind of land use controls, like zoning or at least tax incentives, something to where you can implement your land use plan, and you get a lower match rate if that's the case too. So that incentivizes local governments to do something. On the state highway capacity program, we're talking about capacity expansion of state highways, so it's not even a locally owned issue. But it gets back to that issue of the state has no say over development. The local government's making all the decisions about what gets built and where it gets built. And then they want us to come in and fix that problem for them because it's congested or it's got safety issues or what have you. So what we would want then is to require a local contribution. Yes, it's a state highway, but if you want this capacity expansion, you're going to have to pitch in part of the cost, even though it's a state highway. Perhaps that goes down, again, if you have a basic land use and infrastructure plan. Do you have some land use controls, zoning or incentives? Do you have a building setback ordinance? Do you have an impact mitigation ordinance? Do you have an access management ordinance on the books that meets some minimum state standard? And we'd have to define what that is, and we haven't done that yet. But that then incentivizes people to, yes, we can come help you with some of your traffic congestion problems, but you got to stop shooting yourself in the foot. You can't keep shooting yourself in the foot and expecting us to keep patching you up. So, you know, we need to find some way to incentivize people to take better control of their destinies and start managing their affairs, and then the state can step in and help them. So that's where we're headed with. These are potential policies. You know, we haven't decided on them for sure, and we certainly haven't written any rules for that. But that's kind of where I'm thinking that we need to go. There is a requirement in state law for comprehensive plans. And if you read it, it'll look pretty much like what I went over with you earlier. It says that any such plan with the accompanying maps, plats, charts, descriptive matter may include a commission's recommendations for the development of the parish or municipality as the case may be, including, among other things, the general location, character, and extent of railroads, highways, streets, viaducts, subways, bus, streetcar, and other transportation routes, bridges, waterways, lakes, waterfronts, boulevards, parkways, playgrounds, squares, parks, aviation fields, and other public ways, grounds and open spaces, general location of public buildings, schools, and other public property, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a lot of common sense things that people need to think about. Where are you going to locate your senior center? Where are you going to put your schools, et cetera, et cetera? Where are you going to have playgrounds? And those kind of things. So it's actually in state law. A lot of people just ignore it, and there's no penalty if you don't do it.